Alright, so this is part 4 of the cosmic history video presentations that I've been putting together. And we last left off with the first major explosion in Atlantis in about 28,000 BC. And after this explosion, there was very much so open visitation between the guardian races and the cultures of Earth. So they were using the Alcyone interdimensional spiral for easy access to and from Earth. And this spiral was located within the Great Pyramid teleport station. The Anunnaki resistance, the Dracon, and other allies of theirs were not permitted to access the Alcyone spiral. So if they wanted in, they had to take the long way in and use other intergalactic portals. During this time, there was open commerce with the ET visitors, with time travelers from future Tara, and also time travelers from past and future Earth. Many of the Egyptians' later depictions of gods actually originated from these early days of direct relationship with a wide variety of ET beings. The Templar Anu was pretty upset and wanted access to the Alcyone spiral too. And they also wanted to destroy the Sphere of Amenti. So by destroying the Sphere of Amenti, they could erase evolutionary imprint and trap all of the earthly souls into Harmonic Universe 1. So they wanted to use humanity as an experiment. They wanted to create a worker race that could supply them with Earth resources. So they pirated the Ankh technology from the Anu Melchizedeks, and they sent high-powered electromagnetic pulses from the crystal generators in Atlantis to the Ark of the Covenant. And remember that the Ark of the Covenant is connected into the Sphere of Amenti. They thought that their attack would isolate the Sphere of Amenti as a target for destruction, but the Guardians had placed protective seals around the Sphere of Amenti, which caused a chain reaction explosion within most of the crystal generators. And this happened about 9,500 BC. So these explosions blew apart the main Atlantean landmass, and the other two islands were also decimated and sunk to the ocean floor. Unfortunately, the Syrian Council discovered the plan too late, and they were unable to prevent the catastrophe. They were able to rescue some groups from the Atlantean islands, and many cultures around the globe retreated underground, but some weren't able to enter before the inner Earth portals had to be closed, and they perished. There was another axis tilt, more tectonic shifting, earthquakes, flooding, etc. Giza was thrown out of alignment with Alcyone. Other pyramid structures survived, but it would be many years before they returned to their prior grandeur. So the Syrian Council removed the crystal generators altogether. They decided that these technologies would not be returned to Earth until the people had a more mature comprehension of the proper use of power. And humanity's technological abilities were thrown into the Dark Ages. We became these primitive organizations that are based on survival concerns and built through manual labor. The Guardians also placed further security seals on the Ark of the Covenant, and fifth dimensional energy could no longer be drawn from the blue flame into Earth's morphogenetic field. After the explosions, there were two objects that were charged with fifth dimensional energy prior to the sealing, and these objects became known as the rod and staff, which we've touched on a bit. They housed a small part of the orange gold flame and the blue flame, and they allowed humans to still enter inner Earth, facilitate healing, influence weather patterns, and access portals of parallel Earth. They were also used by the Egyptians in rebuilding surface cultures, but they were later banned from surface use and deactivated. So over time, the chest in which the rod and the staff were stored became known as the Ark of the Covenant, and the true meaning of the Ark of the Covenant and the morphogenetic flames became lost to all but a select few who remembered the significance of these terms. These explosions also sparked the untimely descent of the sphere of Amenti. So remember that Earth needed to be vibrating high enough to hold the frequencies encompassed within the sphere of Amenti. So not only was Earth unprepared to house those energies, but the timing of entry would be completely out of sync with Earth's natural time cycles. And if the sphere of Amenti did enter, it would cause an astral explosion, which would create a buildup of energies through the remaining vortices, and the Earth grid would explode. So the Ra Confederacy, the Elohim, and the Palladorian and Syrian councils created a frequency fence around the Earth so that the sphere of Amenti could not pass through, and certain frequency bands were removed from the morphogenetic field. So the frequency fence was like a natural energetic barrier, and Earth was more or less halted in its tracks of time within the middle frequency bands of the third dimension. So the 10th and 12th overtones, or frequency bands, were left within Earth's morphogenetic field, and this was an advantage for humans, but it created a higher vibrational Earth phantom, essentially. So interstellar visitors could enter their craft in the Earth phantom frequency bands, but they couldn't easily enter onto Earth's surface directly. But the sphere of Amenti could be released into this portion of the morphogenetic field when the time came, which would also trigger the release of the Seal of Pallador and set grounds for eventual release of the Seal of Amenti. It also meant that soul fragments would no longer be trapped in the Dimension 4 astral plane upon death. So the natural portal structures of Earth were cut off from the interdimensional grid. There was no more interstellar transit. The Guardian organization's visitation became limited to emergency situations only. They adopted a policy of non-interference with earthly affairs, with the exception of monitoring and protecting the frequency fence and tending to evolutionary ascension behind the scenes. So the Elohim only allowed humans carrying certain genetic strains to breach the frequency fence. And this basically put Earth in a galactic quarantine. Information that traveled through frequency bands of higher dimensions could not transmit into Earth's grid or cellular memory anymore. And this is when humanity's memory of the past really faded out. So when a soul essence births out of the morphogenetic field of the sphere of Amenti, it passes into the morphogenetic field of the planet onto which it will birth. And it picks up frequency patterns that are characteristic to that planetary core, which helps ground its identity within the collective energy imprint of the planet. And then it passes into a fetal pattern created for its entry. And there is a fetal integration of this soul consciousness into its new form. So that's where a lot of these astrological traits come into play, because these patterns are influenced by the particular time and space in which we enter into this morphogenetic field. So the frequency fence inhibited soul essences from being able to ground or manifest the full imprint from our third DNA strand. And remember that the third DNA strand corresponds to the third solar plexus chakra. This basically brought about another genetic mutation. So the 7th through 12th base tones and the 7th through 9th overtones were blocked out of the third chakra, which created an even larger gap between our conscious mental awareness and our astral level of awareness. Distortion in dream recall developed. So in sleep, consciousness could travel into astral identity, but there was now separation between the waking identity and its astral experiences. We became unable to translate most sensory information between those realms. Prior to the frequency fence, memory and other dimensional experience during dream state were far more lucid, and the memory patterns from these experiences were processed in a much different way. So the conscious recall of higher dimensional experience requires the 4th DNA strand. It was actually the 5th root race that brought multidimensional dreaming and astral projection of consciousness back into the human gene pool. Before the seal of Amenti, dreaming was taking place on a fully conscious level. So even the 3rd and 4th root races did not dream multidimensionally like before. Now that the frequency fence is lifting in our current time and space, sequential dream recall and memory of higher dimensional experience is once again developing in the races. And this includes lucid dreaming, simultaneous dreaming, conscious astral projection, mental bilocation, etc. But this loss of cognizant dream recall has created an extreme sense of isolation, and also an overdeveloped focus of consciousness within the external world. There were 2 aspects of our personal mental identity that were brought into manifestation when all of this went down. There was a portion of our personal identity that started manifesting through the lower base tones of the 3rd DNA strand, and this became known as our ego. The ego carried these limited perceptions of reality and also an exaggerated sense of dualism. It was basically locked into 5 sensory perception. So there was an extreme distinction between our inner versus outer world. And there were portions of our personal identity that began manifesting through higher overtones of the third DNA strand as well. And this became known as the higher self. So the race morphogenetic field holds the individuated morphogenetic field for a person. It contains the higher dimensional aspects of our soul, and it allows for connection to our race and also to our purpose for existence. The frequency fence cut the ego off from a conscious relationship with its personal morphogenetic field and from the morphogenetic field of our race and planet. So we became locked within the illusion of matter, unable to comprehend the reality of non-manifest substance, through which all manifest things are created. So the ego began perceiving itself as finite, and it developed an overly aggressive need to dominate and control its external environment as a means of attempting to ensure survival. So it began revolving around these modes of isolation and loneliness and fear, and healing of these lower astral planes would require integration with the higher self. So the higher self allowed the fourth and fifth DNA strands to begin manifesting, if they were available within the race DNA imprint. And it communicated data to the conscious awareness via subconsciously sensed feeling. And this became known as our intuitive sense. And as we have evolved, we have more and more channeled our higher self. When the third DNA strand is completely assembled, the higher self aspect of identity will merge with the ego, and the mental awareness will again comprehend itself as being multidimensional. If the ego makes a conscious effort to allow its higher self to speak, the third DNA strand assembly process is accelerated, and the information received will evolve from vaguely sensed intuitive impressions to more direct inner verbal and visual communication. So the Templar Anu interbred with many races following Atlantis. They passed on the Templar seal throughout the Melchizedek races and entered into inner earth territories, where, of course, they distorted the original creeds and teachings, both above and below the Earth's crust. I want to interject a note here on the Zephelium race. They visited Atlantis and genetically mixed with the Templar Anu prior to the explosions. They were the original race of modern-day Zeta Reticuli and the Greys, and they sought genetic material from our race so that they could find traces of their own original genetic imprint. They wanted to reverse mutations that had come about within their lineages, and they wanted to create hybrid versions of themselves that were more suited to Earth's environment. But we'll touch on them again later on. There were a number of deviations occurring within genetic imprints on Earth, and if enough souls from lineages with these deviations passed back into their race morphogenetic field, then those deviations would eventually override the original patterns carried in Earth's morphogenetic field, and evolution of the 12-strand DNA package could not take place. So the Rock Confederacy removed portions of the race morphogenetic field from the sphere of Amenti, and this meant that a faction of souls would have to evolve as consciousness on Alcyone for a period of time until the genetic deviations processed out. And they also considered this to be a Templar seal. They ended up removing certain base tones and overtones of particular DNA strands as well. And the races most affected by these deviations were the Templar Anu, the Hebrew Melchizedeks, and the Anu Melchizedeks. So the 12-strand DNA package is one of the highest genetic imprints within Harmonic Universe 1 and 2. It allows for full mutation out of matter and can embody the consciousness of a 12-dimensional oversoul when all 12 strands are activated. So it's important to remember that no human is inferior to another, regardless of what genetic coding is carried. The Hebrew morphogenetic field was realigned from its deviated genetic state about 2,000 years ago with the birth of Jesus Christ. And the Anu Melchizedek and Templar Anu morphogenetic field was realigned about 3,300 years ago with the birth of Pharaoh Akhenaten. So at this present point in history, all of our races are part of the Amenti morphogenetic field, and all of us are in the process of healing and assembling various DNA configurations. So the discrimination of race and genetic lineage and gender and skin color, these are ridiculous notions. They are completely unfounded. They were ideas given to us by ET visitors who wanted to manipulate the evolution of human races. All of the races on Earth, with our diversified gene content, are equal in value, and all of us are intertwined genetically on some level. We need to remember that the true power and beauty of the human races lies within our unity, which allows for diversification, and we're going to heal and prosper by realizing that we all have unique characteristics and gifts, and we are all of equal importance. So those races with the Templar seal were counseled to not interbreed with other races so as not to pass on that gene configuration. But these teachings became distorted, and the original meaning on the ban of interracial mixing became lost and evolved into an elitist creed of genetic superiority. And this discord exaggerated already existing conditions of competition and conquest among races. The halls of Amenti were actually able to be reopened about 1,375 years ago, but then they had to be closed again later on due to interracial difficulties. After the Templar seal, only the Cloister Melchizedeks and the Ceres Egyptians were permitted involvement with the priesthood of Ur and the Ark of the Covenant. These groups did make an attempt to reconstruct Giza and the Sphinx through manual labor, Giza was finally restored around 5500 BC as a religious center, and the Ark of the Covenant was again secured. The Sphinx was restored around 5400 BC, but they altered the facial features to instead resemble the Ceres Egyptian line, but they kept the leonine body as a tribute to the mythological Egyptian gods. And the dynasty periods of Egypt emerged around 3500 BC. But by this time, the Ark of the Covenant, the Sphere of Amenti, and the rod and the staff were closely guarded secrets, and much of that information was kept from the general public.